Hello, my name's Timothea Goddard. So I'd like to start actually with a little bit of practice and just a couple of minutes of sitting and kind of gathering ourselves. So if it's right for you, maybe closing your eyes, having a soft gaze, and turning your attention inwards. Just tuning in to what it's like sitting at your computer, about to listen to this talk and do a bit of practice together. Noticing what's here in the body. All a myriad of physical sensations. Becoming a little bit more present to them. Maybe noticing your emotional tone, what you're feeling like right now. Noticing the kind of thoughts that are here. And opening to the sounds of the place you're in. And maybe opening your eyes, taking in the visual field, which includes your computer, an image of me talking, and everything else that's in the room. So I'd like to begin actually by offering a deep bow of recognition and acknowledgement to all the Buddhist teachers who, by holding their tradition, have enabled this flowering of mindfulness in the world, whether they like it or not, actually, because I know there's a lot of ambivalence about that. And I also want to acknowledge the work of John Kabat-Zinn in his articulation and communication of the Dharma as he experienced it in such a way that it could be accessible to so many people in so many different contexts, so that now we have mindfulness-based programs in all sorts of contexts. Health, certainly, where he started, mental health, physical health, in education, in the justice system, and now even in workplaces, the world of business. So that's our starting place. And one of the issues I think that has arisen as mindfulness as a practice of the Dharma has met quite fulsomely the scientific paradigm and also the world of commerce, where it can be offered as a course, a program, a mindfulness summit like this one. What's happened is that mindfulness can become known as an instrument to kind of do something for us or to give us something, like reduce our blood pressure, reduce our anxiety, help our relationship with our kids, all sorts of things. And we know from the research that these things are actually of real value to people. We know how helpful the practice can be. But I also think it's really important to notice how this kind of instrumental use of our mindfulness practice, and sometimes it's not even practice, but instrumental use of mindfulness can actually change our relationship with it and move it from this thing of being something that we can look deeply into ourselves and find out stuff, look deeply into our relationships with others and indeed the planet. So I have a little story I want to share actually about my niece who, when she was about 12, she got a surfboard for Christmas. And we all went down the beach and she was incredibly excited about it. And off she went for her first surf. And after about 10 minutes, she came back with the surfboard and threw it down on the sand. And she said, "It doesn't work." Very cranky about it. And I'm not sure about you, but this is the sort of thing I sometimes hear in my psychotherapy practice. And I'm often, as we explore that statement that mindfulness doesn't work or not work, I do kind of wonder about how this method for actually inquiring into the nature of human experience can work or not work. It seems like the kind of wrong question somehow. And often as we explore that, what comes out is that maybe they haven't actually done much practice. They've been offered a form of mindfulness that hasn't actually been demanding enough, in my opinion. So I think this very instrumental view of mindfulness can actually lead us into some painful cul-de-sacs and lead to a lot of disappointment and blindness, actually, about what the practice could be or can be for people. I was at a mindfulness conference in Chester this year, and I heard a talk by Christina Feldman. And Christina is an insight meditation teacher, and she works a lot now helping teach and educate MBSR and MBCT teachers. And her talk was about the lineages that have contributed to the mindfulness-based interventions. And it was lovely seeing photos of her and other Western senior insight teachers from when they were about 20, sitting with some of the great teachers of the traditions that have contributed to things like MBSR and MBCT. And she said something really inspiring. She said that if we're really practicing, then probably we're going to become a little bit less surprised, less shocked, less pained when really difficult things arise in our lives. Greed, hatred, and ignorance rise endlessly, and also impermanence, old age, death, sickness is coming to us all. So I'm interested in how our mindfulness practice can be related to, not just as an instrument that can do something for us, but something that can really be a space in which insight can arise. So insight into what is the question. And in a way, all of the mindfulness-based interventions that we might be working in, offering, receiving at the moment are children of insight, with the Western insight tradition. And what the Buddhists reckon is if you practice with some diligence and in a bit of a sustained way, what you find out is these three significant insights about the nature of things, about our existence. And the first one is going to be familiar. It's that pain can't be avoided in this life, that it's an inherent part of the structure of things. And if we try and avoid it, rather than turning towards it and examining it, can lead to all sorts of problems, more pain, more anguish, more distress. So if you've been practicing mindfulness, this will be familiar to you, I know. The second insight is one that captures the truth that everything, this hand, this face, this body, this mind, our relationships, our precious relationships, our work, our homes, everything is impermanent. Everything is a process just passing through. This is radical when you really let yourself know it. And the third one is even this self that we're inclined to love and hate as we go through our lives, even this experience of self is impermanent. It's actually, the practice starts undermining this sense of I, me, mine. And it undermines it as a kind of stable, ongoing concern. And we start seeing into that even this is a construction being constructed in every moment. So this is gold, really, these insights. And in MBSR, sometimes we talk about them as in this way. Life sucks. Everything changes. Don't take it personally. And it's always really inspiring when this kind of discussion emerges in week 6 or 7 of the Mindfulness Based Stress Reduction program, where it arises quite spontaneously, actually, and makes a lot of sense if I say that in a class to people, because they're already having tastes of that in the practice. So, and of course, these ideas are interpenetrating and interconnected. And what I'm interested in speaking about today, and maybe doing a little bit of practice about, is this question. How does becoming more in touch with reality, the nature of things, actually contribute to having a little bit more ease and peace and choice in our lives? And also maybe less warlike configurations going on in here and in here in our hearts. And maybe a little bit less warlike configurations going on with other people. And how could it even start contributing to our understanding of our relationship wider than that with the environment, with the planet, and all the kind of the dilemmas we're in right now as a species? And how can this aspect of practice really be cultivated so it bubbles up and permeates our lives? So let's start with life sucks and sings. There's lots of pleasurable things in life too, as well as it being painful. And in the Buddhist literature, there's a saying about freedom. To be free, we need to embrace the 10,000 joys and the 10,000 sorrows. And I think this is actually quite a big ask, because we've got a nervous system which is really geared to avoiding the unpleasant, the painful, and seeking out the pleasant. So this is normal, and we need that kind of nervous system. We want a nervous system that, if we put our hand on a hot plate, we don't want to be, all kind of reflective about it and say, smell the burning flesh as it goes through the layers of skin. And we want a nervous system that goes, ow, that's bad for me. So this is really adaptive, and it comes from our evolutionary heritage, and it's about survival, this nervous system that is so immediate to and constant in its appraisal of, is this good for me? Do I want to move towards it? Is this bad for me? Do I want to move away from it? So I love the example of a dog with a hot spot. This is us. So a dog with a kind of skin inflammation can't stay away from it. It's distressing. So its attention gets taken there over and over. And there's licking and scratching and trying to relieve that bit of painful suffering. And the problem with it, in that example, it leads to more inflammation, more erupted skin, more preoccupation, more unwellness. And this is what we're like too. If we have a kind of out of awareness relationship to what's arising that's unpleasant and pleasant, then we are on autopilot. We get hijacked by the unpleasant and the pleasant, and we can fall into an immediate kind of bothering of the unpleasant, certainly, and trying to fix it, to adjust it, to diminish it. And of course, can be a lot of skillful action in that, isn't it? We can change things to make things better that are painful in our lives. And I think there's another action which mindfulness training offers us to strengthen another action, which is actually being able to notice and pay attention to that unpleasantness and turn towards it and really examine it. Not just in a kind of passing way, but a little bit more deeply. And when we do that, we get a chance to examine its nature and its qualities, and we start seeing into what it is actually, not just this little bundle of experience, but something that is moving, shifting, changing. Many of you would know this quote about the two arrows involved in human suffering. I'm going to read it. It's from the Salata Sutta. When an untaught worldling is touched by a painful bodily feeling, he worries and grieves, laments, beats his breast, weeps, and is distraught. Now, I'm sure we all know that feeling, don't we? He thus experiences two kinds of feelings, a bodily and a mental feeling. It's as if a man were pierced by an arrow, and following the first piercing, he's hit by a second arrow. So that person will experience feelings caused by two arrows. So this is interesting. And developing the discipline, I think, to investigate the first arrow can be really liberating. And what we do find out is that the pain, whether physical or emotional, is actually made up of characteristics of heaviness or lightness, temperature, movement in the body, a certain quality of denseness, a certain shape or vagueness. And if we really look into it, both pleasant and unpleasant experiences and neutral ones, what we find out is that these experiences are changing, they're transforming in the moment as we're looking and experiencing. And of course, the other really liberating thing to start noticing is if we pay attention in that way, the very act of paying attention changes our relationship with that experience, but it also often undermines our reactivity to it so that we start feeling a little bit more spacious, at ease, at peace. So really a wonderful thing to cultivate, to be able to really turn towards the pains in our lives without quite so much reactivity. They're not a problem to be avoided or extinguishing because they are the nature of things. So how do we say yes to this pain in our lives? These physical and emotional unpleasantnesses that are just an ordinary part of living. And they're to do with having a body, being a body, and also being a mammal, living in social groups with all the uncertainty and the 10,000 joys and the 10,000 sorrows that involves, of negotiating belonging or not belonging. The other thing that's really important and very nourishing to remember is we're not alone. We're all in the same boat. We've all got the same body, the same mind. It operates in the same way, and this can be really helpful, I think, to help us even in our ability to turn towards. I think that's why mindfulness works so beautifully in a group, actually, because people hear other people's suffering and they hear the transformation of it as the weeks go by, and people feel not alone. They can really see into the structure of suffering. And I also love teaching in a context where the groups are heterogeneous, where there's people from all sorts of walks of life struggling with all sorts of different things. I think this really helps this sense of all being in the same boat. So what I'd like to offer now is a little bit of practice to just sit with this first insight that life involves suffering, painful things as well as pleasurable things. So if you're willing, closing the eyes or having a soft gaze, and again turning your attention inwards, taking a moment for this to settle in you. Noticing what your response is to what I've said. Has it stimulated something, opened something, closed something? And now let's maybe spend a little bit of time in just examining the kind of pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral things that are arising right now in our bodies as we sit here. So, turning your attention inwards and expanding the focus of your attention to take in the whole of the body. And checking out, seeing if there's any sensation in the body that has a kind of pleasant tone to it. Feels pleasurable some way. Might be quite subtle. And resting your attention here and examining it in this moment. So as you tune into this pleasurable sensation, just noticing if there's a temperature to it. Is it warm or cool? Neutral? Is there a sense of heaviness or lightness there? Is it vague and nebulous, or is it quite well defined? Is there a sense of movement in the sensation? And by movement I mean a sense of pulsing, throbbing, tingling, flow maybe. Or is it very still? Is it changing? Now letting go the focus on that pleasant sensation and opening your attention wide again and feeling into if there's anything happening in the body now that's unpleasant. Even subtly so. Bringing awareness to this and turning towards it with your attention and investigating it a little, feeling into whether there's a sense of heaviness or lightness in the sensation. Is there heat or coolness? Or maybe a neutral temperature? Is there an experience of movement? Throbbing, pulsing, tingling, or not? Is it very well defined? You can really feel the edges of it, the shape of it, or is it quite vague and nebulous? And noticing if you can expand the focus of your attention now to include this unpleasant sensation as it shifts and changes, checking that out. Is it changing in this moment? However subtly. And now expanding your attention wide to take in the whole of the body. Maybe noticing the capacity to hold pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral sensations, sensations that don't really call for our attention. Seeing if it's possible to hold these in our attention, in our awareness, in this moment, arising and passing constantly. And shifting the focus from that moment of practice. Although, why stop actually? We can practice and listen and talk at the same time, I hope. So in a way, we're onto the second insight already. Everything changes. And this can be really reassuring, I think, when things are sad or miserable or physically painful, when we're sitting in practice and we're waiting for the damn bell to ring. But sadly, all pleasant things are going to pass too. And again, our nervous system is really organised for homeostasis. We have a deep organismic desire for stasis. So this is why changing patterns, even though we know they're not helpful for us, is so difficult. And even though we know it's going to lead to more pleasurable outcomes, we so much like to stay with what we know, how things have been. And let alone letting go of our minds and bodies in the face of bigger changes like getting old, becoming ill, dying, having an accident. And I think it's deep in us, this kind of sense that it's not going to happen to me. I remember when I was about 10, my mum must have been about 40, and she did a lot of sewing. We did a lot of sewing together. And at that age, she started needing me to thread the sewing machine needle. And I remember I was happy enough to do it, but I remember, really thinking this was just, what a loser. Like it was a personal flaw of hers that she was losing this capacity. And I think this is incredibly common in us, to really believe that, especially when we're young, to think, that's not going to happen to me, because we're full of our aliveness, our wellness, and that's what's in the foreground. But maybe through the practice, through paying attention to the fine changes that are always happening, we can start cultivating a knowing of the impermanence of things. And I love the way Thich Nhat Hanh frames the 5 remembrances, which in the Buddhist tradition one's invited to kind of contemplate, invite into your life in a way, to remember these things. And the 5 remembrances are: I'm of the nature to grow old, I'm of the nature to have ill health, I'm of the nature to die, everything and everyone around me is of the nature to change. My actions are my only true belongings. I cannot escape the consequences of my actions. So maybe this is something we can get friendly with in our lives and see what happens. It's an experiment. See what it offers you. And I want to read a poem now by Mary Oliver about death. And it's a beautiful poem. It's called The Black Snake. When the black snake flashed onto the morning road and the truck could not swerve, death. That is how it happens. Now he lies looped and useless as an old bicycle tyre. I stop the car and carry him to the bushes. He is cool and gleaming as a braided whip. He is as beautiful and quiet as a dead brother. I leave him under the trees and drive on, thinking about death, its suddenness, its terrible weight, its certain coming. Yet under reason burns a brighter fire, which the bones have always preferred. It is the story of endless good fortune. It says to oblivion, not me. It is the light at the centre of every cell, and it is what sent the snake coiling and flowing forward, happily all spring, through the green leaves before he came to the road. So we are of the nature to age and die or have an accident, but we're also of the nature to not know that, to be in this quality of endless oblivion. And yeah, that's okay. So in a way, it's part of our biology, I think, to not know this stuff. And I suppose the question is, what could it offer us to be more in touch with the unfolding of things in this way, and that it's part of our heritage and our lives as mammals on this planet, that this is going to happen to us. I also think contemplating impermanence really is heart-opening. Simone Weil says this. She says, human existence is so fragile a thing and exposed to such dangers that I cannot love without trembling. So I think really knowing our fragility, knowing the delicacy of our lives, the passing throughness of our lives can really open us to appreciation and an open-heartedness towards ourselves, but also to all other creatures. So let's take a little moment to just reflect on what's arising in the face of this insight. You may want to close your eyes or have a soft gaze. Becoming present in a more vivid way with what's arising in the body. In the heart. In the mind. What kind of thoughts are arising? And noticing if contemplating in this way about the impermanent nature of things opens the heart or closes it in this moment. Does it in this moment lead to more of a sense of aliveness or deadness? There's another lovely poem that I want to share with you by Bertolt Brecht. He was a playwright and a poet and a Marxist. And he writes this poem about impermanence, which I find very capturing of what the Dharma's about for me. Because it speaks to the endless possibility available in the present moment, but also to the very basic understanding and acceptance that there are causes and conditions arising that we need to take responsibility for if we can. So here's the poem. It's called Everything Changes. Everything changes. You can make a fresh start with your final breath. But what has happened, and the water you've poured into the wine cannot be drained off again. What has happened, and the water you've poured into the wine cannot be drained off again. But everything changes. You can make a fresh start with your final breath. So, now let's turn to the third insight, which is about not taking it personally. Also a wildly difficult thing to do, I think. I remember a friend of my mother's who, when her partner died, he was 83, I think, and he'd been having blood transfusions every couple of weeks because he was very ill, and she was 81. And when he died, she rang my mother and said, "Why did this have to happen? Why me?" And I mean, in one sense, that looks crazy, doesn't it, to ask that, given her age and that she'd been around, I'm sure, other people dying. But I think we need to deeply honour that sensibility, because I think we all have this sense to some extent that of deep offence, of deep personal insult when bad things happen to us, and certainly when our mortality is threatened. And it can be, I think, enormously helpful to hang around people who don't take it personally, A really personal example of this is my Uncle Ross. When he was 70, he was one of those sort of people who'd never been sick with anything really. And he was learning how to play tennis, and he was having his tennis lesson, and he started to feel a bit crook. So he went to the doctor, and they did some tests, and he found out he had leukemia. And the doctor said, you can have 2 weeks if we don't treat it, and you've got about 3 months if we treat it with strong chemo. And he was like, I think I'll go for the 3 months. And it was such a joy to be around him, because when I went to the hospital the first day, it was a couple of days after he got diagnosed to visit, and he said, I'm feeling a bit unwell. And I said, oh, well, Ross, you're dying. That's going to make sense, isn't it? But he said, Tim, there are people in this hospital who are saying, why me? And they're old. And what he was referring to was that there had been a tsunami about a week before in New Guinea, I think it was, and several hundred people had died. Little babies, toddlers, 10-year-olds, 30-year-olds, 60-year-olds, all sorts of people. And he said, how can people know that there was a tsunami and all those people died in that random way and be asking why me? So he was a very special person in that way, not taking it personally. And it was very refreshing to be around him, very nourishing, watching him move through that process of dying in a really curious way, like he was investigative of it. I think we all have a really deeply held belief and sense that the self has a really inherent essence. Like, that's the phenomenological experience, I think, of being a human. And that exists. That experience exists. We do experience ourselves with continuity, moving through time. And we're compelled by how our brain and body works to actually have that experience. And it can lead to a sense of ourselves as quite fixed, stable, unchanging, rather than as a process that's being constructed moment by moment, and not just constructed by history, but constructed in this very moment by being able to breathe this air, by the food I've just eaten this morning, by my context of relationships. I can only feel the way I do because of all these others in my life. It's not up to me in that way. And I think this is such a powerful and liberating insight, even though I think it can be quite a lot of work to realise it, of course. And we're all in that boat, aren't we? So it's also pretty amazing that this person we are and we experience is truly unique, that there will never be another one of us in the universe. But who is this me? Who is this I? And it's arisen, this I that I am, has arisen out of my unique genetic material. It's really dependent on my parents having got together, having fallen in love, had lots of babies. I was one of them. That's how I got my life. And the unique genetic material that I am, that I'm expressing, depends on their parents having got together, and their parents before them. All these random acts that we had nothing to do with. So even though we all do and kind of need to take personally, that I've got red hair, or, whether I'm sporty or smart or can write essays, or I'm not so good with maths, all those things are arising out of this stuff that we didn't have much to do with. We didn't have any control of it, actually. And then there's our unique developmental experience. We were all born into a particular family, and our parents, for better or worse, were quite good at giving us what we needed, and some of them weren't so good at it. And that's painful, and it leads to all sorts of consequences that then we need to live with and take responsibility for and look after. But again, a lot of that stuff was completely out of our control. We were simply a little baby being born into that context and looking up and saying, okay, this is the way the world is, huh? And then, of course, there's the social cultural experience, being born into a Western developed country, rather than one where there's a lot of poverty in a kind of shocking way. So, and this social cultural experience really does shape our expectations, how we think things should be, what we think we need to have a sustained life. So when we speak of not identifying with a fixed sense of self, it's not like we aren't experiencing an ongoing sense of self, and it's not about not knowing your history or knowing your subjective reality as it unfolds moment by moment. But the invitation is there to explore how rigidly holding on to this fixed sense of self and the narrative that arises out of that can limit wholeness and cause ourselves suffering. And I think it's very important to stay arriving in the present moment, to know the ongoing changes and shifts in the self moment by moment. I think that practice opens up a lot of possibilities in each moment. And we're all driven by a desire or a thirst to be a certain kind of self and to not be another kind of self. So in our community, you and me, maybe being interested in mindfulness, we might be interested in being a very mindful self and demonstrating to others that we're very mindful, whatever that means. So this desire to be a certain way does set up a kind of ongoing battle inside ourselves that really undermines a sense of peace and ease, I think. So really important to find a way that our practice can start really knocking on that door of, is that so about me? Can I soften around that? Do I have to hold that so tightly as a definition of myself? Can I welcome in the parts of me that I know are ashamed or contemptuous of others or greedy or ignorant? Can I actually be known in that way and let others know me in that way? Do I have to be so defensive to construct a particular kind of self that looks a certain way? And I think our job here may lie in becoming more familiar with abiding in awareness. That lovely question, if I'm sad, is my awareness sad? If my knee's hurting, is my awareness hurting? Very helpful question, I think, to step into wholeness in that moment, rather than identifying with the insult or the content or the difficulty or the fight with the difficulty. And abiding a little more fluidly in awareness, knowing the shifting, pulsing, changing nature of things, including this self. And this emergence of non-identification, I think, is the key. It's not something we can willfully do, but I think it can emerge out of practice. Suzuki says, what we call I is just a swinging door that moves when we exhale and when we inhale. So we're a process, not a problem to be solved or fixed. And I think it's so helpful to recognise that this process is, a lot of what's driving this process is out of our conscious control, and a lot of it sadly is out of our awareness. So our practice hopefully can bring the sort of spotlight of awareness to this process, and so we can have a wiser relationship with it. And Thich Nhat Hanh speaks beautifully to this process perspective when he held up a piece of paper and said, can you see the tree? Can you see the sky in this piece of paper? Can you see the micronutrients, the water, the person who cut it down, the solar system? Everything is in this piece of paper if we bring this more interconnected view of how everything is arising in this moment. And I think if we open up to the connectedness of this experience of I, me, mine, with everything and everyone else, I think it's really radical. And it may even break down some of the us and them experience that feels almost, feels perennial for humans sometimes. And we may even be outed from a psychological or individualistic practice and feel the call to respond collectively. What can we do together to kind of address the kind of pressing concerns that are around, like climate change or the painful, agonising refugee crisis that's happening the world over? And as I said before, if we train ourselves to stabilise our attention through meditation and non-avoidance, if we listen to our heart through this work and take responsibility for our interconnectedness, we may be able to do something quite helpful in terms of the kind of challenges we're facing as humans, right here, right now. And in this larger context, I think our mindfulness practice might move away a little bit from being a kind of individual panacea and being sold in that way too, to soothe us individually and also to kind of sustain the status quo. And if we can make this shift, our mindfulness can actually move into being a more kind of fierce agent of change, perhaps in a chosen, valued direction. So let's take a moment to sit together here now. Taking up your seat. I'm wondering if you can hear that thunderstorm coming where I am on Facing Island. Big thunder. So, turning attention inwards and just noticing what's maybe been touched in you by this exploration, what's been opened in you. One of the things that can kind of happen as we stay close to these insights as we move through the day is more of a sense of what matters. What needs attending to. And also, how might I serve the unfolding of things in a valued direction? What's my contribution? What can I offer? So, that's the end of my talk, and thank you for listening and being present with me through it. Thank you.